Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines critical issues and events of history. Today's topic that we will be analyzing is Jesse James. No, I'm not talking about that guy who married Sandra Bullock. I'm talking about the real Jesse James, the Western outlaw. And this will also include his group known as the James Younger Gang. So why do we even remember an outlaw who died in 1882? Well, mostly it's because he was the best. I'm not saying this with admiration. He was a despicable person. He murdered a lot of people. But when it comes to those Western outlaws, he lasted for approximately 16 years. Now, that was pretty remarkable. Most only lasted a few months, maybe a year or so. Then they either went to jail or they were dead. Jesse James set the standard. Other Western outlaws wanted to be like him. An example, the Dalton Gang. You may have heard of them. They were called the Dalton Gang because they consisted of the four Dalton brothers and usually one or two others. Bob Dalton once exclaimed that he could beat anything Jesse James ever did, and that he would rob two banks at once in broad daylight. To give him credit, he did that stupid scheme. On October 5, 1892, the Daltons tried to rob two banks on opposite sides of the same street in Coffeyville, Kansas. Now, one of the big problems was you spread your people out instead of concentrating on one bank. Also, they were stupid enough to do this in a town, Coffeyville, where they had lived. So people recognized them. The shooting began. 4 of them were killed, and 1 survived, Emmett Dalton, who went to prison. All right, let's get back to Jesse James and the James Younger Gang. How did they get started in their outlaw careers? Well, this happened right after the Civil War. Now, to set the stage, Frank and Jesse James, the two brothers, as well as their friends and cohorts, the 4 younger brothers, all lived in western Missouri in Clay and Jackson counties near Kansas City. Missouri was a slave state, but it was very split. When people talk about how certain areas were brother against brother and family against family in the Civil War, this was it. Although Missouri was a slave state, it did not secede from the Union and join the Confederacy. It had a majority of pro-Union sentiment. So, during the Civil War, there weren't many actual battles between Confederate armies and Federal armies, at least not in Missouri. But there was a lot of guerrilla fighting. The guerrillas in those days were called bushwhackers. Frank was a few years older than Jesse, and he started out as a guerrilla fighter early on in the Civil War. He rode with a notorious bushwhacker leader named William Clark Quantrill. Jesse did not join until 1863 when he finally was 16 years old, mostly just because he was too young and Quantrill didn't want a boy that young. Later in the war, Frank and Jesse James fought with an even more despicable bushwhacker leader named Bloody Bill Anderson. This guy was a true psychopath. He liked to torture people before he killed them. There's at least one recorded incident of him cutting off a man's ears before finally putting the man out of his misery with a shot to the head. Also, Bloody Bill Anderson would have his bushwhackers collect scalps of their victims. They tied the scalps to their saddles. Yeah, imagine that. Fortunately for humanity, Quantrill and Anderson were both killed during the war. Now, these guerrillas or bushwhackers were incredibly violent. We don't know how many people they murdered, but it was usually during surprise attacks and often against unarmed civilians. Even though Jesse James was involved in a lot of shootouts in his guerrilla days of the Civil War, he was only shot twice. The first occurred in August of 1864 when he was trying to steal a saddle from a farm. Unfortunately for Jesse, the farmer saw him And since everybody was always armed in those days, he shot him. The bullet went right through the right side of Jesse's chest, came out the back. It ended up being a clean wound, and after about 4 weeks of recovery time, he was back in the saddle and back to his bushwhacking days. Now, the other time Jesse James was shot during the Civil War, or at least immediately thereafter, was in May 1865. The war essentially ends when Lee surrendered on April 9th, 1865. Now, later on, Jesse James would claim that he was trying to surrender and went into town in Missouri under a white flag and that they just shot him for no reason. Most historians doubt this. They think he was up to something no good, whether there was a robbery or murder, something bad. But he again gets shot in the right side of the chest. This bullet doesn't go completely through and remains in his body for the rest of his life. He was incapacitated for a long time, various descriptions about how long it took, but he was out of action for a while. Okay, so who were the other members of the gang? Obviously, first two are Frank James and Jesse James. Frank was older than Jesse, but Jesse was the leader. They also rode with the Younger brothers. They had become friends with Cole Younger during their guerrilla days. Cole had 3 younger brothers, Jim, John, and Bob. With the 2 James brothers and the 4 younger brothers, there was another man named Clell Miller. That group was pretty much the core of the James Younger gang up through 1876. Sometimes they would add a different person or two, and not all of them were involved in all of the robberies. The big 3, Frank and Jesse James and Cole Younger, appeared to have been involved in all of the big robberies. Now, one of the core members was killed on March 17, 1874. Jim and John Younger were headed to visit some friends in Roscoe, Missouri. They ran into a deputy sheriff and 2 Pinkerton detectives. Now, who were the Pinkertons? Alan Pinkerton had set up the first big detective agency. It was based in Chicago, but he sent his agents throughout the country, wherever his clients were hiring him. He was hired by a lot of big companies, people who were getting robbed, like stagecoaches and particularly trains. Well, they ended up being the mortal enemies of the James Younger gang. So getting back to March of 1874, Jim and John Younger get stopped by a local deputy sheriff and 2 Pinkerton detectives. A shootout occurs, which results in both Pinkerton detectives dead, as well as John Younger. The sheriff made his escape, and so did Jim Younger. So when did these guys begin? The war ends in the spring of 1865, and it's unclear when all the members of the James Younger gang got into outlaw activities. Certainly by 1868, but it seems that by the beginning of 1866, less than a year after the war ends. On February 13th, 1866, the Clay County Savings Association in Clay County, Missouri, was robbed. The significance of this, it was the first daylight peacetime armed bank robbery in U.S. history. It was carried out by the gang led by Archie Clement. Archie Clement was a friend of Frank and Jesse James from their guerrilla days. Some point after that robbery in February 1866, Clement and some of the others were killed by state militia. Thereafter, Jesse James rose to prominence as the leader of the gang, and instead of being known as the Archie Clement gang, it became known throughout the region as the James Younger gang. All right, so how did these guys last so long? Why didn't they get caught? Well, first and foremost, they were incredibly professional. They planned their robberies. It wasn't like you see in the movies where they just ride into town, spot the bank, go in, scream, "This is a robbery," fire a few shots in the air, take the money, and then run. They did their research. They scouted the target. They always proceeded like it was a military operation. They planned their exit routes. They also positioned their people like it was a military operation. Certain men went inside, other people stayed outside on guard duty and with the horses. All right, another reason why they lasted so long was because their robberies were spread out. You get the impression from old westerns that these things were happening every week. Now, there were usually months between these robberies. And during those periods between the robberies, the gang would disperse. They were not just all hanging out together. They would go their separate ways, sometimes as far as California. So they were very hard to track down. Another reason why these guys lasted so long, they had the protection of so many of the local citizens. People would hide them. People would cover for them. Why would people protect outlaws? Although Missouri was split between its Union sympathies and its Confederate sympathies, the counties where the James brothers and the Younger brothers came from, Clay County and Jackson County, were very Southern-leaning. Most people there sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War. So after the war, it was mostly Yankee businesses that were doing well. So the locals were not thrilled with the Yankee businesses like banks, railroads, and stagecoaches. Not only did they not care that these businesses were being robbed, they were happy about it. But on a deeper level, the locals sided with the James Younger gang because they viewed them as these unrepentant Confederates still fighting the good fight of the lost cause, meaning the Confederacy. Now, why did people view them that way? Partly, Jesse crafted this image. When they were robbing people on a stagecoach or a train, he would ask if any of them had fought for the Confederacy during the war. People who said that they did, he refused to take their money. Word got around. Now, it's unclear whether this was true gratitude for his fellow Confederate warriors or just a good PR move. But either way, it worked. But even more than this was the great press that the James Younger gang got from some of the local newspapers, primarily the Kansas City Star. They used to print letters from Jesse James, and in these letters he would proclaim his innocence. He and his brother were nowhere near the location of that dastardly deed. And he always claimed that he would turn himself in as soon as he thought he could get a fair trial, but he knew he couldn't get a fair trial, so that's why he stayed on the run. Most of this good press came from this publisher named John Newman Edwards. During the war, Edwards had been the adjutant to Confederate General Joe Shelby, guy who operated originally out of Missouri. After the war, Edwards retained his Confederate sympathies. He became the publisher of the Kansas City Star and later some of the other newspapers throughout the state of Missouri. He wrote lots of articles defending the James Younger gang. Now, he always had to walk a tightrope. He would profess the innocence of the James Younger members, but also state that even if they did do what people were accusing them of doing, robbing a train, stagecoach, bank, whatever, well, who could blame them? They were pushed to it by the way that the Confederate guerrillas were treated after the war. Nobody would give these guys a break. So they didn't do it, but if they did, you couldn't blame them. In 1877, John Newman Edwards wrote a book titled Noted Guerrillas. It was in full praise of the James brothers, as well as the other bushwhackers under William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson. He portrayed them as heroes of the lost cause. People bought into this. But besides local writers and publishers like John Newman Edwards, the country at large was fascinated with Western outlaws, and Jesse James was the number one subject. Became very romanticized, kind of like a Robin Hood type character. All right, so let's look at what kind of robberies did these guys do. We don't know exactly how many robberies were committed by the James Younger gang. There are a lot of disputes over the actual figures. We know that they started with banks. These were coordinated efforts. And I'll go into detail about the Northfield, Minnesota raid because that's their most famous, but I'll do that in a little bit. After robbing several banks, they started to add stagecoaches. The reason for stagecoach robberies was because of the money being transferred between different banks, usually going out of or into Missouri. They would also rob the people on the stagecoach, but that didn't produce very much money. It was mostly the strong box that contained the money. They did other types of robberies, whatever presented itself. We know of at least one time they robbed a county fair in Missouri. But at some point, they moved on to trains. The railroads provided their biggest hauls. So how did they rob a train? Well, first thing you gotta do, you gotta stop the train. Usually, they would coerce a switchman, one of the guys who worked for the railroad. They would hold a gun to the switchman's head and order him to put out a red lantern. That was the signal to the engineer that there was a problem and he needed to stop the train. Of course, they would do anything to stop the train. On at least one occasion, they tore up the tracks, which caused the engine to topple over, resulting in several deaths. Let's focus on one of their most famous train robberies. January 31, 1874, 6 members of the gang robbed the Little Rock Express from St. Louis to Texarkana. The robbery occurred near Gads Hill, Missouri. We know that Frank and Jesse were there, Cole Younger was there, and 3 other men. We don't know who the 3 others were. One man, which they think was Jesse, waved a red flag to signal the engineer. Apparently, Jesse was unable to get a switchman who would have a red lantern. Well, the engineer saw it, saw the red flag, and stopped the train. The other 5 climbed aboard with masks on and guns drawn. First thing they do, they go into the express car. That's where the safe would be located that was transferring the large amounts of money between banks. Now, these guys would scout out these train schedules and be tipped off by people as to when there was going to be a large transfer of money. Because most of the time, there weren't large transfers. That was just an occasional item. After they emptied the safe, they would go through the mail car, looking for any money or valuables that was being shipped through the U.S. mail. And lastly, they would rob the passengers. How did they keep a train full of people calm and not fighting back? Well, mostly it was intimidation, but also threats of murdering the conductor, engineer, or other personnel from the railroad. They would tell the passengers, anybody who takes a shot at us or resists in any manner, we're going to kill these men. They usually kept people in line. The most significant item from the Gads Hill, Missouri train robbery is what Jesse did when they were done and they were leaving. He gave the conductor a telegram to be sent to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. So he wrote out in a telegram that he wanted printed in the newspaper. It starts, "The most daring train robbery on record." And then he describes about the events of the robbery, how much they stole. He claimed that it was about $10,000. Estimates are that's probably about right. That would be about $250,000 in today's money. Then he described these fine fellows. The robbers are all large men, none of them under 6 feet tall, all mounted on fine blooded horses. But it's the ending of his telegram, which did get printed in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. It ends with this great quote: "There is a hell of excitement in this part of the country." Now you can see why this guy became so famous and people were so fascinated with him. Even if you did not like what he was doing, he was a very interesting person to follow and provided great copy in the newspapers. So where did they do their robberies? Most of their robberies were in Missouri. Why? Why would they be robbing and killing people in their home state? Well, because the locals would protect them and hide them out. There were times they went outside of Missouri. There were at least a couple of times they went into Iowa close to the Missouri border so they could get back home quickly. And we know of at least one time they went to West Virginia for a robbery and one time to Tennessee. Let's talk about Jesse's personal life. It is amazing that a man who was operating the way he did had a personal life. He actually got married and had kids. April 24, 1874, he married Zerelda Mims. She went by Z. Now, the reason I tell you her formal name is because she was named after her aunt, who happened to be Jesse's mother. Yeah, that's right. They were first cousins, and his wife was named after his mother. Paging Dr. Freud. All right. Now, he had 2 kids, Jesse Jr. and Mary. The kids never knew his real name, never knew what kind of business he was doing. They thought his name was Thomas Howard. That was the alias he used. They did not learn his name until after he was assassinated. So although they tried to have a somewhat normal family life, they did move around a lot. Okay, so it's time to talk about the Northfield, Minnesota raid. This occurred on September 7, 1876. Who participated in the raid? Frank and Jesse James, Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger, Clell Miller, the Core Six, and they brought along 2 other guys named Charlie Pitts and Bill Chadwell. Why did they go to Minnesota? They only had problems because they left their southern base. Well, they went up there because the bank in Northfield was operated by a relative of Adelbert Ames. Also, this guy, Adelbert Ames, supposedly had about $50,000 on deposit in the bank. So who was Adelbert Ames? I love that first name, by the way. As you can guess, he was a member of a very wealthy family from Minnesota. They owned a mill. But the reason why he was hated by the James Younger gang was because he had been a general on behalf of the Union forces in the Civil War. After the war, Adelbert Ames served as the Republican governor of Mississippi. During Reconstruction, that period after the Civil War, a lot of Northerners were elected to run the former Confederate states. And these Northern Republicans were not very popular with the local whites because they enforced black people's rights, including the right to vote and the right to personal safety from reactionary groups like the KKK. So Jesse James and his friends hated Adelbert Ames. That's why he was willing to lead the group up to Minnesota. So they took the train up to Minnesota. They spent 2 weeks in the area learning the region, especially the roads, so they could have escape routes. So what went wrong? People like to claim there were all kinds of specific reasons, but it simply comes down to a lot of bad luck. Eventually, the James Younger gang was going to have some bad luck. So here's what happened. Frank and Jesse went into the bank with Charlie Pitts. Clell Miller, Bill Chadwell, along with the 3 younger brothers, Cole, Jim, and Bob, were scattered along the street outside of the bank. Frank and Charlie Pitts pointed guns at the 3 men in the bank. Jesse did his usual bit of threatening to shoot the cashier in the head unless he opened the safe. Now, the cashier said that he could not open the safe because it was a time lock. This was a new device at the time. The safe could only be opened at certain times of the day. The rest of the time, even the owners of the bank could not open the safe. This safe did have a time lock. However, the safe had not been locked. If Jesse James had just pulled on the door of the safe, it would have opened. Amazingly, this cashier was willing to risk his life to prevent this bank robbery. Things were kind of at a standstill when one of the other 2 bank employees decided to make a break for it and run out the back door. He was shot by either Frank James or Charlie Pitts, but the man made it out of the door and started yelling that the bank was being robbed. Of course, the gunshot from Frank or Charlie had also drawn the attention. Soon, the whole town realized the bank was being robbed. Cole Younger was in charge outside. He told the other gang members to clear the street. They did this by shooting up in the air and also yelling for all the townspeople to clear out. The townspeople comply, but this just resulted in the townsfolk being able to shoot at the gang members from covered positions inside of the buildings. The gang members were exposed on the street. Giant shootout occurs. Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell are killed in the shootout. Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger all are shot, but they survive. Now, the problem with this being in Minnesota was that the people throughout the state were now looking for the James Younger gang. If they had been in Missouri, they would have known plenty of people who could have hid them and helped them escape. But they had no friends or relatives in Minnesota. And because of the shootout, they did not have time to stop and cut the telegraph lines, which they sometimes did. This resulted in the news going out on telegraph, and now it seemed like the entire state was looking for the James Younger gang. After a few days of being on the run, the group decided that they would split up to make it easier to possibly escape. Frank and Jesse went out on their own, and the three younger brothers and Charlie Pitts went a different way. Within a few more days, the Youngers and Charlie Pitts were caught by a posse. A shootout ensued. Charlie Pitts was killed. All three younger brothers were shot some more, but all three of them survived. They were captured and sent to prison. Only Frank and Jesse James escaped to get home to Missouri. So what happens after the Northfield raid that went so terribly wrong? Frank and Jesse moved with their wives and kids to Tennessee. They settled down in peaceable lives outside of Nashville. Frank seemed to have enjoyed the retirement and being a farmer. He had had enough of the outlaw life, but Jesse grew bored. After about 3 years, he returns to Missouri to resume his criminal lifestyle. Frank participates in at least some of the robberies from 1879 to 1881, but it's unclear which ones. Now, the gang that Jesse was able to put together after Northfield was not the same as the pre-Northfield gang. Before Northfield, those men had all been guerrilla fighters in the Civil War. They were hardened professionals. The men Jesse's able to form into his new gang are not experienced and not professionals. His gang primarily consists of Ed Miller, Clell Miller's younger brother, who had died up in Northfield, Dick Little, Wood Height, and Charlie Ford. Charlie had a younger brother named Bob who wanted to join the gang and finally did so in late 1881. This was after the Blue Cut train robbery, which occurred on September 7, 1881 in Missouri. If that date sounds familiar, yes, September 7th was also the date of the disastrous Northfield, Minnesota raid. This train robbery went smoothly. Nobody was killed. Robbers got away with about $3,000. The reason why I mention it is because it was the last robbery by Jesse James. After the Blue Cut train robbery, there was a fallout between two members of the gang, Dick Little and Wood Height. They got in a dispute over a woman that they were both interested in. There was a shootout between them. It's unclear, but it appears that Bob Ford joined in on Dick Little's behalf and killed Wood Height. Now, the significance of this is that Wood Height was Jesse James's first cousin. So Bob Ford and Dick Little both thought that Jesse would kill them if he ever found out. There's a theory that that's one of the reasons why Bob and his brother Charlie Ford decided to assassinate Jesse James. Of course, another possible reason was simply the money. Thomas Crittenden was the governor of Missouri at the time. During the Civil War, he had been a colonel in the 7th Missouri State Militia Cavalry, fighting on the Union side. He was not a fan of the James Younger gang, wanted to rid the state of Missouri of these outlaws. So he authorized a reward of $5,000 that was going to be paid by the railroad corporations for the capture of Jesse or Frank. Charlie and Bob Ford made a deal with Governor Crittenden. They would shoot Jesse James in exchange for the reward money of $5,000, as well as a pardon for murder. Because even though he was a wanted outlaw, contrary to what you see in the movies, it's still illegal just to go ahead and shoot somebody. So when does the assassination take place? In the spring of 1882, Jesse and Z, along with the two kids, were living in a house in St. Joseph, Missouri. On the day of April 3, 1882, his wife Z and the two kids were in the house. So was Jesse James, along with Bob and Charlie Ford. At some point, when Jesse and the two Ford brothers were in the parlor, what we would call a living room nowadays, Jesse stands on a chair to either straighten a picture hanging on the wall or to dust it. There are accounts both ways. While he's standing on the chair with his back to the Ford brothers, Bob shoots Jesse in the back of the head. One shot, and it was fatal. News breaks, and it goes national. It's one of the biggest news stories of the decade. So what happens to the rest of these outlaws? All right, let's start with Bob and Charlie Ford. After shooting Jesse James, they immediately contact Governor Crittenton. He ends up pardoning them for murder, and they do receive the $5,000. Then, amazingly, the Ford brothers go on tour. They put on shows in theaters recreating how Bob shot Jesse James. It was a 3-person performance, Bob playing himself, Charlie Ford playing Jesse James, and they would have a woman playing Z James, Jesse's wife, who just comes in and screams when she hears the gunshot. By the way, a kind of cool thing about Bob Ford. In 1975, Elton John came out with a song, I Feel Like a Bullet in the Gun of Robert Ford. It was on his Rock of the Westies album. It's not a big hit, but it is kind of an odd thing. So what happens to the Ford brothers? Contrary to what they expected, they became pariahs. A lot of people viewed it as a cowardly act, especially shooting a man in the back of his head in his own house when his wife and 2 little kids were in the next room. Charlie Ford has difficulty with the hatred that the Ford brothers receive. He develops tuberculosis, becomes a morphine addict, and then kills himself on May 4, 1884. Bob Ford moves around a bit and eventually ends up in Creede, Colorado, where he opens a saloon. On May 29th, 1892, 10 years after he shot Jesse James, Bob was in his saloon when a man named Edward O'Kelly entered the saloon with a shotgun. He called out, "Hello, Bob," and as Bob turned to see who it was, O'Kelly shot him with both barrels, killing Bob Ford. Arguably the most interesting character was Frank James. He never went to prison. He was the only gang member who did not either get killed or go to prison. 5 months after Jesse was shot by the Ford brothers, Frank turned himself in to the governor of Missouri. He stood trial twice, once in Huntsville, Alabama, and once in Gallatin, Missouri. He was acquitted both times. There was a lot of sympathy for him because of the way his brother was killed. And they think that's one of the reasons why he was acquitted. He was never sent to Minnesota to stand trial for the Northfield raid. There were rumors that he had made a deal with the governor of Missouri that he would turn himself in if the governor promised not to extradite him to Minnesota. Well, after he's acquitted, Frank goes straight. He holds various jobs until he meets up again with Cole Younger. As I said earlier, the 3 younger brothers, Cole, Jim, and Bob, were captured after the Northfield raid. They received life sentences. Bob dies in prison of tuberculosis on September 16th, 1889. Jim and Cole eventually get paroled on July 10th, 1901. And although nobody knows why, about a year later, on October 19th, 1902, Jim kills himself in a hotel in St. Paul, Minnesota. What happens to Cole Younger? Well, first of all, he writes an autobiography, which was a semi-success at the time. And then he goes back to Missouri, meets up with his old buddy Frank James, and they form a Wild West show entitled The Cole Younger and Frank James Wild West Company. This occurred in 1903. It was a pretty big hit for several years. People mostly just wanted to see the two famous outlaws. Frank eventually dies of old age, February 18, 1915, in Kearney, Missouri. The last of the James Younger gang, Cole Younger, dies on March 21, 1916, in Lee's Summit, Missouri. And that was the end of the James Younger gang. Well, that's it for today. Please subscribe to the History Analyzed podcast. If you're listening on one of the podcast sites like Apple Podcasts, which allows for ratings or reviews, I would appreciate both. Please tell your friends, relatives, coworkers. Word of mouth is greatly appreciated. You can check out my website, historyanalyzed.com. And relating to today's podcast, I have several photos so you can see what these guys look like. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you on the next episode.